Today is the last lecture. Remember that the first couple of lectures, we started with the issues with law and development, introductory considerations, analytical model, and we picked out a few key issues. One was property and the other was business relations. And today is industrial policy. It's really important in the sense that, again, if you look at all the successful development cases since the World War II, we're talking about several East Asian countries, more recently China, every single country has adopted very active industrial policy. So I would like to see what that is and where it really falls in the context of our understanding of economics and development and law, and see what lessons can be drawn from that, okay? That's where we're going to go. All right, what is industrial policy? It's a wide range of government policies included, and the purpose of industrial policy is to target promotion of domestic industries. There are many kinds of policies that are considered industrial policy. That includes financial grants, so the grant money from government. Loan guarantee, that's a government guarantee for a loan. So a company A in country X goes out and take a loan from, bank B from other country. Then government comes out and guarantee for the repayment. So that's, part of industrial policy that can be taken. Tax rebate is another tool. So the government gives tax break or tax reduction for the economic activities that government deems appropriate and helpful for economic development. And both developing and developed countries, government does provide support for R&D. So that's research grant from the government, research support, infrastructure, and so forth. Facilitation of social infrastructure is also important. So government building roads for the industrial complex, building ports, airports, all these are also important policies that government can take to promote economic development. Another very interesting policy tool is trade measure. So if you look back what Korea did back in 1960, the World Bank has noted that Korea used the market actively, which was true, and promoted export aggressively externally to other countries. But on the other side, Korea also used trade to protect the domestic industry, meaning that import restrictions of various kinds. So trade measures are another important tool for government to promote economic development. Now, industrial policies used by both developed and developing countries are well noted. So, yes, the East Asian countries extensively used it, and that led to very rapid economic development. But also developed countries have used them too. So in the article that I sent you, you'll find the work by Haejun Chang, that's a Cambridge professor, really talking about the cases of industrial policies taken by Great Britain, United States, and others. So if you look at all these different policy tools for economic development, the big category is government subsidies and trade measures. So these are the two major components of straight industrial policy. So items like financial grants, loan guarantee, tax rebate, R&D support, these are government subsidies. Tariff measures, other measures promoting export and restricting import could be considered trade measures. The critique is there for those policies. And if you look at the liberally minded economists, their usual critique is, look, those government subsidies and trade measures are inefficient allocation of resources, meaning that the private market and private industries would have to do what's best for them. I can explain that. not the government. So why government providing all these subsidies? Why government restrict imports? Why government helps with exports? So this is not a good use of resource, according to classical economics. On the other hand, there is a middle ground, and scholars such as Daniel Roderick has mentioned that you could see industry policy as just a good provision of public goods, such as giving good education to people. Both industrialists and classical economists would agree that providing good education is positive for economy, and this could be considered good industry policy. So what we need to understand at this point is the controversy surrounding the use of government industry policies. So all these subsidies and trade measures, are they positive? Are they a good thing? Or they are waste? Okay? Now, in order to figure out this dilemma, I have picked out South Korea to be an example. The reason is, get to you later, but South Korea is a good development case, part because it has reason to advance the economy from poverty within one generation. So that is a short enough time frame, it's a convenient time frame that we can look at to see how economy could develop from one to another, right? So we'll take a look at that. All right, first, controversy. So which is good? I mean, do you have to leave to the market, or do you have to let government provide all these subsidies and trade measures to promote economic development? So we will see how these are so different. Now, classical economic approach is very different. What they're saying is all these government subsidies and trade measures are, quote unquote, economically inefficient, meaning that if, for instance, Jing Chen set up a company, then somebody who knows what the company should do best is Jing Chen, because she's the one who set up the company, she's the one who's running the company, she has most stake in the company. So she should be trusted with her decision to do whatever she wants with the company, not the government. So government doesn't have to give her any subsidies or any measures or protection whatsoever. Leave to the market. That's the classical economic approach. And why is it? Well, because the market has something called invisible hand, meaning that the market understands what's necessary for the economy. So what needs to be supplied, what needs to be purchased, in what terms, and there is no need for external interference. The only case that something has to be done to the market is when market fails. So if the market has, say, monopoly, which means that one supplier, and one supplier sets everything, then obviously that's an issue with market failure. Monopsony, there is a one customer instead of many. Externalities, such as air pollution, somebody has to pay for it, but that the beneficiary doesn't really have to pay for what it causes in terms of harm to society. These are non-market transactions that has to be corrected. Public goods, national defense. There are a number of beneficiaries for national defense, but because there are so many, it's not clear who has to pay for it. Symmetric information. Somebody has the information. For instance, the buyer has information, but seller doesn't. So there is no exchanges possible because of that asymmetric information. So all these things could be a market failure. Other than that, market knows the best. So if the government tries to involve in the economy, it only leads to inefficiency. Why? Because again, the suppliers and buyers in the market will know the best as to what needs to be supplied, what needs to be produced and consumed, and what terms the best. And economic growth comes from a division of labor. So, which means that a person, if you are producing a car, then someone focuses on the car body, someone focuses on the car seat, someone focuses on making engines. So this creates inefficiency in production. So economic growth comes from the division of labor like that, but not from state involvement in the economy. So all these subsidies and trade measures look like they're not consistent with the classical economic approach. By and large, still the mainstream idea is leave it to the market. So international rules, such as WTO, World Trade Organization, or the policies that are given to developing countries are based upon something called Washington Consensus. Okay? Washington Consensus is a belief, that's a shared belief, that certain policies are helpful and healthy for the economy, such as deregulation, limit the involvement of state in the economy, privatization, so more private entities in the market, and financial scrutiny so that there is no financial waste in the government, so forth. So Washington Consensus represents classical economic approach. Leave it to the market. All right? This idea, market economy, is not only economic idea, but also it leads to political aspirations. Because if you leave it to the market, what it means is that you have to respect the autonomy of individuals in the market. So that relates to the promotion of individual freedom, democracy. So it really appeals to the Western civilization that has created the modern world today. That the market economy is just not the idea of economy, but also it leads to political aspirations of the Western civilization. So now you understand why it's so central, why it is so influential and powerful. All right? Do you have any questions about what market economy represents and how it can be different from industrial policy that I explained in the beginning?
I have no questions.
Are we all clear about that?
Yes.
Okay, good. Let's move to the next. However, as we have seen in the case of property rights and business relations, again, there is a gap between ideal aspirations and the reality. Now, the efficiency of market economy comes from the presumption that everybody is rational, meaning that everybody can or will decide what's best for him or herself. So, that is a rational person. So Jing Chen, my student, can do the best, make the best decision because she knows what's best for herself. She has information, she has intelligence, so she, better than the government, knows what's best for her. We call that's a rational person assumption. But is it correct? Is it correct? Is it always the case? The other argument is, yes, we would like an individual to be a rational person, but on the other hand, human beings are also bound by irrational things. Human beings are bound by custom, bound by practice, bound by fear, history. So realistically, if you go to, say, some place in Afghanistan where Malawan is coming from, then they have done whatever they've done, farming, whatever, for thousands of years. And all of a sudden you come out and say, look, you have XYZ resource. I can give you AB technology. So you all stop what you're doing and, begin with new industrial, basis. Here's the information, here's technology, decide. I'm not sure if they can readily make that decision because they have done something else for a long time and people are not rational more often than many of us would like to believe. It's not only developing world, also developed countries. If you look at 2008 financial crisis, based upon the financial product, which is very dubious, very irrational, because that financial product to many people didn't make sense at all. I'm not going to go details of that, but the financial crisis happened because of financial products which did not make much economic sense. The whole U.S. economy and the world hurt by this. But where is that rational person? Just a little bit of detail. Asset-backed securities. They have engineered, re-engineered, and created secondary and a third derivative financial products out of the original. At some point, you don't know who the debtor is and you don't know who the creditor is. Hence, you don't know what the quality of that the loan product is. That's irrational, and you won't be able to deal with those things if you're a rational person. But some of the smartest people on Wall Street dealt with it. Why? Because they thought they were making money, and it wasn't much to do with the rationality. So reality, again, has a gap. And history also has a gap. Ironically, if you look at what happened in the US and Britain in the 18th century, the position that's taken by some of the most prominent US personalities at the time are very different from today's US position. I'll give you a little bit. Adam Smith, in his The Founder of Modern Economics, warned in his the book The Wealth of Nations that U.S. should remain whatever it has been doing, agricultural product, and do not try to interfere with trade. Do not try to protect, their domestic industries. Do not do anything about it. Again, the details in the book. Now, Alexander Hamilton and Henry Clay, both were prominent U.S. politicians, disagreed. The Hamilton has argued that U.S. will catch up. In the beginning, you don't have a technology, but later on, U.S. will learn and catch up. So that justifies temporary protection of U.S. industries until it grows up and enough to compete with Britain, which it did. Henry Clay, advisor to Lincoln, also mentioned that this attempt by the British, so-called free trade, is really an attempt to try to keep United States as a food producer for the British Empire. So that's very different from today's U.S. position advocating free trade. I'm not trying to say free trade is wrong. The point I'm making here is we all know that the United States of America developed industrially in the 18th and 19th century, and it became dominant industrial power by the beginning of the 21st century. However, in the 19th century, one of the most prominent U.S. politicians argued that U.S. will have to protect these industries and overcome this claim of free trade by British because it's not in the U.S. interest to do so. Okay? So obviously, the way that the United States developed in the 19th century was far from free trade. And in the matter of fact, up until 1940s, U.S. maintained the highest tariff rates in the world. So following this, there was another policy argument advanced by a German economist called Frederick List. And he was influenced by prominent Americans such as Alexander Hamilton and Daniel Raymond. And his idea is that the free trade is beneficial among the countries at similar development stages. So if Afghanistan exercise free trade with a country at a similar development, yes, they can complement each other, they can develop. But if there is a gap between trading partners, so an African country, industrially not developed, should try to trade with the United States, what's going to happen is that that country will rely on the U.S. for industrial goods, and it'll never have a chance to develop on its own vis-a-vis those industrial products, right? So, again, there is a criticism about this, but again, if you go back to Haejun Chang's work, then he lists up a number of cases of infant industry policies adopted in today's developed countries in the past. So he talks about the cases of development in the U.S., Britain, Swiss, France, Japan, Germany, Russia, everywhere. And then one question. So the case we've seen out of this development is many other developing countries follow this suit. So India tried to develop by trying not to rely on trade, but they tried to develop their own industries. Latin America did that, but they failed. And why? I think there is a place where trade becomes very necessary. So if you have supported industries by state, then state cannot support industries forever. So at some point, those industries will have to become self-sustained, and that's where trade comes in, because you need a foreign overseas market. If you don't have enough domestic market, so countries like India, Latin America, they did not have sufficient domestic market to sustain their industries developed by state, so they eventually failed. But if you look at all these other countries, such as Britain, United States, Korea, China, they were able to sustain their developing industries through trade. But dominant idea, economic and development idea these days still, a little bit adjusted after 2009 financial crisis, but the dominant mainstream idea is still classical idea that market should dominate. So, when the scholars, practitioners looked at China, that they wondered then why China has developed the way it did, even though the China did not practice the Western style of the market economy. And if you look at South Korean case, again, when Korea developed in the 70s and 80s onward, the Korean economic policy was far from neoclassical market policies, where state interference was minimal. There was an active state involvement, as we will look at later on. So what are the implications? Market has its function. So the classical economics may not be wrong in the sense that the market creates efficiency, in a sense that it really efficiently determines the supply and demand point, what has to be produced and what has to be consumed, probably better than anything else. It does not mean, however, that state has no role. State has a support role, and that has been proved in the development cases of South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, China, Japan, and elsewhere. Then the question is, how does government support most efficiently? Now, one argument is government should support new activities instead of a sector. So instead of government supporting heavy industries or textile industries or steel industries, they have to support activities such as R&D support, new development support, whether it's industry A or B. But an argument again is that if the country is developing, it has a limited resource, then the call for all this non-sectoral support is so big, and you might have to focus on sectors to maximize your impact. And again, that has been shown in the development cases in the past. And again, development policy alone is not sufficient. The policy alone, law alone, is never sufficient. So you need relevant factors. And again, the reading material lists up some of the factors. That includes political stability, we talked about it, some technological basis, education, work ethics, entrepreneurial spirits in the society, and so forth. Another interesting question here is, and if you look at development process of all these countries, including China and Korea, they're all manufacturer-based. So the question raised was, can you promote economic development more service-based? And India, for instance, is trying that. But the question is, when you're developing, then you want to create jobs, you want to create industrial bases, and service seems to be weak in terms of creating a number of employment and even exportability. Again, the question of export was there because your domestic market was not big enough, and then you needed foreign market to sustain your industries, and how much export is really possible for the service. So it looks like still that the manufacture is the most necessary. And there's a regulatory standpoint. Now, the rules of WTO do not allow certain industrial policies anymore. So some of the policies that were possible yesterday, before 1995, are no longer possible. That includes export subsidies. that government provides subsidies for exportation. That's no longer possible. Government provides subsidies for those firms that are using domestic product instead of foreign. We call it import substitution. That's not possible anymore. They are prohibited by WTO rules, and WTO rules govern 140 countries, including all the major economies. Again, if you have any question, let me know, and we'll move on to the next. Let's take a look at Korea and see how all these arguments and policies have been practiced. Why South Korea? A few reasons. One, it's a good experimental case because in 1960, which is only about a few decades ago, the Korean economy was the poorest in the world. Some say it was the poorest, second poorest. It was worse than Afghanistan today, worse than Kenya, as Obama has said. So it was absolutely most impoverished economy in the world in 1960. But by 1990s, only one generation, Korea had become one of the most advanced economies in the world with industries. So this is a good development case. See what happened in the process. You all know where Korea is, what Korea was. Korea is a small country, about the size of half the New England, maybe, and the population of 45 million. So a substantial population with a very small land size. And most of the land, 70% of land is a rock mountain. So it has nothing but rocks for 70% of the whole territory. Harsh winter, very hot summer, so only one harvest possible. So, some say that Korea had nothing but people on it. So no natural resource, no technology, no experience in economy. At least Japan had the technology in 1945, Korea had none. So you had the worst possible conditions to do any economic development in 1960. Actually, at the time, North Korea was far better economically than South Korea because North Korea had natural resources, not the South Korea. So against this background, makes a very interesting case. And the second, the reason the South Korean case is interesting is because it adopted a range of state-led industrial policies. It's irony because South Korea was the closest ally to the United States, which practiced free trade, which advocated market economy very strongly. At the same time, Korea was able to use all these industrial policies because of its success, I suppose. And third, again, there was a rapid development despite initial lack of natural and financial resources, technology, management skills, and national security. So for a country, small developing country, which is the majority of developing countries today with nothing, Korea is a good example to start with. It is a great success story in economic development history. GDP per capita was less than $100 in 1960, all the way to $26,000 in 2013. But by 1990s, Korea had escaped from poverty and became OECD country. And what's most notable about Korean development is sustained GDP growth. 8.2%, some say 9%, about that, for 35 years, from 62 to 96. So what distinguishes Korea is the period of sustained development, which is well over 3 decades. Another point of observation here is economic transformation from a primitive economy based on low productivity agriculture, such as so many other developing countries today, to one based upon advanced manufacturing technology. And export drive was strong, so the way the Korean economy developed is through trade, no doubt, through aggressive export. So I happen to have been raised in Korea from 60s and onward, and the most frequent thing I ever heard in living in Korea was export. So everything has to be export. And the slogan was export number one, meaning that even the 5-year-old who doesn't know about trade will have to chant export. So everything was about export, trade policies. So here is the data. Now, export amount was $20 million. There's a dollar sign missing from there. $20 million in 1960 all the way to $617 billion in 2013. And export increased by 27% annually in the 70s and 80s. So if you look at GDP growth, it was about 8, 9, some even say close to 10%. But export growth was over 27% annually. So you can see what led what. So export was leading economic growth, right? And then the share of share of manufacture, 27% to 93.7% in the export. In GDP share, from 9.1% to 41.5%. And share of agriculture declining from 45% to 19%. So the picture is very clear. One, you had an export-driven trade policy. Second, there was an increase of manufacture in the economy and decline of agricultural. And along with it, very fast economic growth. Next, the government. Oh, there's another stat I can show you here. If you look at table 1, are you looking at table 1 now?
Yes.
Yes, you can see the real GDP growth rate here, and then the good export values, export growth, and exports of goods and services per GDP. So you can see the increasing trend. Export increased exponentially, and the portion of export in the economy was also growing very fast. So this is a typical export-driven development. So let's take a look at the contribution of international trade to economic development. It breaks the circle of poverty by assessing consumer demands in overseas market. What it means is the economy has the circular continuation of poverty because of low income, whatever you produce, it doesn't get sold. Because it doesn't get sold as much, you cannot sustain production. Because you cannot sustain production, your income always remains low and low consumption. So that goes on and on. The only way to break that is to find a market. Because you don't have your own market, you go to foreign market. That's why the trade is important there. Another thing is economies of scale. Because foreign market has a purchasing power, you produce more, that means a lower production cost and higher profit level. And then, of course, you have to compete internationally. So your productivity quality improves. And that leads to also managerial efficiency improvement because you have to now manage better to sustain increased productivity and production. And that accelerates technical progress too. So the benefit of trade, according to this, is enormous. You're not only going out of poverty by making money, so to speak, but you are really upgrading your economy and structure by all these external contacts. So it's no longer every single successful development country after World War II, every single of them did it through trade. So such a huge country such as China, the ratio of trade in the economy is very high. It's over 70%. Japan developed through trade. Taiwan did it through trade. Singapore, Hong Kong, Korea, everyone grew by trade. And you know the reason why. And success factors, I talked about a bit, but now again, education is important, cultural elements. Government, not necessarily democratic, but the government dedicated to economic development objectives. Now, recently, economists ran an article on Rwanda, and the article said it was puzzling because Rwanda wasn't, according to their view, wasn't exactly democratic, but for 20 years they were developing very fast. Why? Well, the answer is, even without democracy, the government dedicated to economic development that is stable can help. Efficient administration, strong coordination between the private and public sectors working together, financial support, access to the world market, regulatory space, prior to WTO. All these things contribute. So don't let me say that economic policy alone is enough. It's not. But along with all these factors, it can be powerfully influential for development. So what Korea did now, state comes in. State, the government started to help with development in early 1960s through tax. That's how it began. So-called tax exemption and reduction control law. So here, again, the state using law as a device for economic development. So what it did was, look at this, it's interesting. They reduced profit tax on income from exports as much as by 80%. So if you're making money from exports, you're making more money because you're not going to have a lot of tax on it. That's a huge incentive for exports. And then the promotion of heavy and chemical industries in the 70s. So what Korea did was transition. 1960s, Korea had no technology, had no managerial skills, so they started with the very basic exports. They even exported human hair to make wigs, or seaweed for Japanese. And then when they have made money out of those exports, they have used those money to upgrade technology and production techniques, capacity. So in the 70s, they made a transition into heavy and chemical industry. Why? Well, because their income was going up, so their labor cost was going up. So all this light industry like textile, all the labor-intensive industries were losing competitiveness. So they used that as an opportunity to going into heavy and chemical industries in the 70s. And they did what? They provided tax incentive for the first 3 years of establishment in those areas. So if you're helping with the government and going into those areas in the 70s, again, your tax is less. In the 80s, Korea is becoming a sizable world-class industries already in the 80s. So what they've done is we don't need quantity anymore. We're going into quality. So what do? Again, tax incentive for R&D support, research and technology support. So see what Korea has done. The states are providing tax incentive for the activities they want to promote. So in the 60s, they wanted to promote export, so they're giving tax priority for exportation. They wanted development of heavy industries in the 70s. You give tax profit, tax benefit in those areas. 80, you wanted to do research and technology, so you give tax benefit for those areas. So see how they use the law, because all this has been done in law for consistency. So what you're seeing here is the use of law to target industries and promote them, right? Now, much of these policies cannot be used today because WTO now has an agreement called WTO Subsidies Agreement, and they prohibit export subsidies. So you can't do it right now any longer. But these have been used. Then what can be used today? There is something called the duty drawback. That's allowed under WTO. And that's implemented in Korea since 1975. What it does is, if you are importing goods from abroad, using those imports for your export industries, then they pay you back the duty you have paid for those imports, right? So they have been used inextensively, 0.3% in 1975 to 2.6%, which is sizable. So duty drawback, paying back tariff you paid for the imports if they were used for exportation. So the role of law here is clear. By doing this with legislation, you instill the consistency in the application of tax reduction exemption. It's not one-time off policy. It has to be a consistent policy. And by doing this as a law, example is a tax exemption reduction control law, you're providing consistency and the sustainability of your policy. Duty drawback too, that's also done by law. Second, financial incentives. Until 80s, the financial sector was under government control. And what it did was to make scarce resource focused on industrial development. So the state created policy loans directed to strategic industries for economic development at an interest below the market rate. So what government does is to place a control over financial sector and use all the resources available for industrial support at a rate below the market rate. So that's policy loans. Strong financial demands by growing industries. Obviously, industry grow, you need more money. So there was a high interest rate generally because the demand for money was very high. That led to highest savings rate in history for Korea. So economy grows fast. There's a lot of demand for money so that they can use it for investment. And that led to a high interest rate and a lot of savings coming from people. And then government use it to make policy loans at a low interest rate. Now, most interest rates have been liberalized in the 80s. And some say, and IMF, for instance, have made an argument that, well, because Korean government controlled finance sector so closely, it made the financial sector weak, uncompetitive, and that's one reason why Korea had the financial crisis of 1997, maybe. But it also is undeniable that the state control of finances helped greatly for its economic development in the 70s and 60s, and even early 80s too. Now that the financial support by the government, some of them still remain today. So many of them are gone because of their reform imposed by IMF in the 1997 and the development of Korean economy. That Korean economy developed to the extent that it's no longer efficient for government to control it. But there is some remaining financial support which can be referenced. That is provision of credit for small and medium industries R&D activity by Korean Technology and Finance Corporation. So that's a semi-government corporation that provides credit for that purpose. Export financing, the financing to help export, not the export subsidy, but financing export, made by Korea Export-Import Bank. And there is guarantees for repayment of SMEs commercial loans. Korea Credit Guarantee Fund. This is good because small and medium industries are the ones that can grow. And Korea still has this policy tool to help repaying those loans made by smaller and medium-sized firms. Another very distinctive and important feature is Export Insurance Fund set up by state. That is, if you are exporting, especially small and medium companies, exporting and somehow couldn't get paid, then there's an insurance fund covering up the loss. It has been actively used. What it does is to encourage small and medium firms to export because the risk is covered by the insurance. And all of these policies, again, have been enacted by law. Any questions so far?
No, I have no question.
Free trade zones. This is a familiar topic for me because in my practice, I helped some developing countries to set up special economic zones and made some recommendations. So I'm familiar with this area, and Korea used free trade zones actively to promote trade and development. Now, free trade zones is simply that the physical zone created in the country that facilitates export and import by providing regulatory and policy benefits. For example, no tariff. For example, provision of electricity or other services at a lower rate. So all the developing countries, like Korea used it extensively, China used this extensively, Taiwan did it, and Singapore, in a way, the whole country is a free trade zone. So is Hong Kong. So, there are some examples here. Export processing zones. You can read the details. There was a very successful implementation in the 70s and 80s in South Korea and Taiwan. And benefits to the country is obviously employment. You give benefit for the firms coming into those areas, special area. That area creates employment, and it obviously helps with export, and that leads to foreign currency earning. So in the early stages of economic development, in my case, I helped East Timor, which is least developed country, and these earnings could help. And then, of course, you have to think about the cost of constructing special economic zones. So, again, then how these zones are created by special legislation that allows benefits and privileges for those zones. So again, this has been created by law. Another also very important feature for Korean development is institution. I mean, we have underscored the importance of institutions many times, and the Korean development owes much to its very unique institutional framework. Very famous of all is the institutional focus on economic development represented by Economic Planning Board, EPB, which started in the 60s all the way to 90s. That covers the development period of Korea. EPB only answers to the highest level of government, president. It oversees all the ministries for one purpose and one purpose only, economic development. So EPB is empowered to plan for overall economic development plans. So they did 5-year plans 6 times and coordinate and instruct government departments. So one of the problems with developing countries is bureaucracy. So you try one thing at Department A and Department B either doesn't know or doesn't care or even doesn't like. In that case, you end up just having internal departmental fights leading to nothing. That happens a lot in developing countries. In order to prevent that, EPB was established in Korea in the 60s to oversee everything for economic development. Control tower, so to speak. So that's the institutions that consolidate political support for economic development. So the EPB had an absolute political confidence from the top, and it can engineer and mobilize. It has financial powers. And the president himself, in the case of Korea, this is very unique in history. For a number of years, he had a monthly meeting, getting around everyone, every major figure, both private and public sectors, getting in the one room. It's called extended meetings for export promotions. They talk about everything about export and the economic development. Because the meeting is presided by the president himself, the issues arisen from the meeting tend to be resolved. And what's interesting is I've heard some of the meeting tapes, and one of the questions the president always asks is that how is it going to work under the existing law? Can it be done under the existing law, or do we need something else? So obviously, in his mind, institution and laws are important. So the meeting is attended by president and all high-level officials in the area of industry export promotion, as well as major private sector players. So this is very close coordination between the public and private sectors, going all the way to top, and that has been sustained for a number of years. And legislation to support economic development agendas. So legislation to support 5-year economic development plans, Export Promotion Act, Trade Transactions Act, all these legal devices were mobilized to support economic development. And managing trade. It's correlating the amount of import approval to export performance. So they used, now under WTO rules, today you can't do that, but in the past in Korea, they actively manage trade to the extent that the amount you can import by licensing depends on how much you export. Okay? So this is called economic development through legal device, legitimacy, consistency, and effectiveness. Again, this is not synonymous with democracy or maybe the Western concept rule of law. But nonetheless, this is extensive use of law, mainly for consistency and clarity and permanence. Okay, final points. So we still have an interesting controversy between the state-led industrial policies that have been evidenced in the countries such as South Korea, Taiwan, China, Japan, and even 19th century Germany and others, and then free trade aspirations, free economy, market economy aspirations, where the state involvement in the economy should be minimized. The debate has been going on for a century, and I wouldn't be surprised if the debate continues for another century, part because this free trade and open economy and market economy really speaks to the ideal of Western civilization of individual freedom, autonomy, and democracy. But the point has been made in this lecture that the actual development cases do not necessarily correlate or correspond to the prescriptions of the market economy as such. We've seen the process. Now, the success of export-led development policies teach us a few things. One is, if you study development, law and development, and you will hear that import substitution exercised in India and Latin America failed. Export orientation, which represents open economy, according to World Bank, successful countries are South Korea, Japan, and others. Correct, but half correct, because import substitution and export orientation are not mutually exclusive. And countries such as Korea, China, and others did use import substitution vis-a-vis protecting their own industries. They did both. Export orientation, very aggressive exportation, and import substitution, both. And trade was managed by state according to economic development plans. Market was still used. So when Deng Xiaoping advocated the socialist market economy, he himself did recognize the utility of the market. So market was used, but not everything was left out to the market. That's the difference. So market-based private sector economy was the key. But you had both. You had market, and you also had the state. So it coexisted with substantial public sector. And there was an information asymmetry. Not every player in the market had the same level of information, and the gap was filled up by the government. And there was a cultural expectation of government role. The government should be taking care of people. That's Asian Confucian thinking, maybe. And the government's role in fostering development corresponds to that expectation. Okay? And then the government planning was flexible. So if you look at 5-year plans from 60s and 90s in Korea, every time the objective changed for better, because objective in the first time. So when Korea was developing in the 60s, they were focusing on textile, light industries, and so forth. And then they shifted to heavy industry because they were successful in the beginning and they were flexible enough to make changes. Same goes for China. The rights granted to people in the market functions have increased because China's economic outlook has been changed. So flexibility was another key. And then again, we cannot overlook the factors for the success of industrial policy, which includes education, work ethics, and political stability, efficient administration, public-private sector coordination, financial support from the international community. And when Korea was developing, initially there was discomfort from Washington because they thought that the government was involving too much. But when they saw the sustained success, U.S. did help. Access to foreign market, they had export markets, and they had a regulatory space. And this concerns us because since the WTO, that regulatory space has been, much of it has been closed down. So all these factors were very important and essential. And then we have to remember the important role of law. All these policies that I've listed out for Korea and elsewhere, these policies are done by law. It's done by legislation. Some people tend to identify the rule of law with democracy. Democracy, I think, is an important substantive factor of the rule of law. But beyond that, the law has this function of providing consistency and sustainability in policies. And it was essential for all those policies being implemented in the form of law. And legal frameworks were also important. And then Korea had coordinated legal frameworks in different subjects going towards the common goal of economic development. And Korea did develop institutions, and others too, develop institutions for economic development. Economic Planning Board was a good example. President himself was meeting, having the monthly meetings for all these important figures in the trade and development. All these are institutions that were focusing on economic development. So what you need for economic development from these lessons is the flexibility, the legal structure that's functional for economic development, and institutional framework that works with the objective of economic development. So I guess this concludes today's lecture.